Hey, Alyssa.
Hey, Sam.
Hey, Dr. Badali.
Hello,
Are you guys both ready today?
I am ready.
I'm ready.
So, for today's episode, Dr. Badali has agreed to come back on the podcast to talk with us about some anxieties that Sam has been having. Our 8-month pregnant Sam. So, if you didn't catch our previous episode with Dr. Badali, where we talked about phobias and what was the other thing we talked about?
What didn't we talk about, frankly? We
Honestly.
talked about anxiety and depression and stuff like that, too.
Then I will give you a quick little intro. Dr. Melanie Badali is a registered psychologist with over 20 years of experience, and she specializes in anxiety and is very passionate about protecting our world's mamas. So kind of what had happened here was Sam had taken to Twitter and...
As I'm known to do.
Yeah, what was your tweet?
I think I was just tweeting about, like, anybody that was afraid of, like, childbirth and how did it go for you and stuff, just so I could hear everyone's horror stories.
Yeah, and this is something that Sam is so afraid of, if I can speak on here.
Please do.
Because I think sometimes people can think, oh, like it's just a funny tweet or whatever. But this has been something even before Sam got pregnant that she had come to me with, she had come to Matt, her husband, about. And it's something that like really causes you a lot of fear.
Yeah.
And so I think that Dr. Badali had kind of read between the lines there and seen that, you know, it is a serious thing that Sam's scared of. And there's other things that come along with motherhood as well, you know, postpartum depression, and you already struggle with depression. So Dr. Badali reached out to us and said, hey, let me see if I can come on and speak to you about it. So thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today.
It's my pleasure, and it's an area I'm really passionate about. And don't worry, Sam, I'm not going to try and do psychotherapy on you or assessment or anything like that. I'm just here for education, and it's one of those things I really admire you guys for being good role models or influencers, I guess is the more cool term these days, you know, to really start the conversation about this, because there's so many moms who think these things and feel these things and suffer, and don't have, you know, the confidence, or they're just not ready yet to be able to talk to people about it. So thank you so much for having me on today.
Thank you. Just to jump right into it, I think people have talked a little bit more about like postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety and stuff like that. I think that's becoming a little bit more well known. But I guess my first question is there a difference between regular depression, anxiety, and postpartum depression and anxiety? And if there is, what is that main difference?
I think that's a great question. I mean, if you dig into the literature and you look at, you know, what causes these things and what do these things look like, there's always, you know, many factors that go in. It's seldom like one thing. You know, for me, they look very similar in terms of how they present. But what is tricky is that, you know, just having a baby or being pregnant makes it harder to see sometimes for healthcare providers, but also for people themselves. So for example, you're really, really tired. You feel like, you know, you're covered in tar and you just can't get out of bed. You know, if you weren't pregnant or just hadn't just had a baby and weren't sleeping, that might just, you know, you'd be like, oh, something's definitely wrong here. I can't go to work. And, you know, if you're pregnant, you'd be like, oh, maybe this is just normal. I got hormonal changes. I've got physiological changes. My body's doing different things. I'm like growing a baby, or I just had a baby. And so I think there's a lot more confusion about exactly what's going on for people themselves. And, you know, so that makes it a little bit harder to figure out exactly what's going on and whether we should just say, you know, it's a wait and see approach and time will take care of it and you'll be back to normal soon. Or, you know what, I think something's going on here. We got to pay attention to this and throw some strategies at it or some medication, whatever, you know, the best thing is going to be for the individual. So I think it's a really good question. And I think in terms of like if you were doing an assessment and you were looking at different symptoms, it's not like we're looking for different things with, depression or anxiety. It's just that sometimes it's really harder to see. And also like
Yeah.
sleep deprivation, which is often it goes along with this whole process, really makes it hard because it's so hard to regulate your emotions and feel good when you can't sleep. And
Yeah.
that's happening for a lot of people, and not just people, not just women who are having biological pregnancies, but people who are adopting and parents of all genders, and different ways of getting the babies. Like babies disrupt sleep, even the
Yeah.
it happens, and some babies are harder than others. Like they actually are harder, and some people's environments make it more challenging. If you have a safe environment, that's easier. If you have a lot of support, that's easier. And yet still, sometimes people will have their first episode of depression even though they have all that stuff in place. It just comes on. And in enough people, maybe like 40% of people will have their first episode, and they've never had any history of, anxiety or depression. So there's definitely a lot coming to the table in terms of biological factors and social factors and individual factors, historical factors. They all come into play during this period. So if you're like, what are the symptoms, and you don't have information that's specific to pregnancy or the postpartum period, you can look at the regular information and just sort of customize it for yourself.
Yeah. And I find that that's kind of like speaking to almost like the confusion around it. Like I find that so many new parents, like that's kind of like what they have to say, is that they're like, I didn't even realize, because, I think there's like a stigma around it, and there's also that guilt of feeling like, well, do I not love my kid enough? Am I not, whatever kind of thing. And I think so many people sort of like almost justify it as, well, maybe I am just tired or whatever, and it's kind of glosses over this bigger issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bring two big pieces. One, there's that stigma. I don't want to say out loud that I'm not enjoying my baby, or I'm not grateful for being pregnancy. What, people are going to think of me. Does that make me a bad mom? Are they going to take my baby away? And I've
Yeah.
definitely seen a lot of people who are afraid of that if they admit to certain symptoms. And yeah, it's extremely challenging. And you mentioned the word stigma, and this one is, again, I'm so grateful for you guys doing the show and talking openly about this stuff, because stigma is one that doesn't need to be there, right? And
Yeah.
there's two main types of stigma. There's external stigma. That's other people saying, oh, you're a bad mom if insert whatever. And it can be anything from, like, I've had people who've like, I'm not using organic baby food, and feel bad about that, or feel bad about they really wanted to breastfeed, and it's not, their bodies are not cooperating with that, and they have to do formula, and they've been given the messaging that breast is best and fed is best has not made it into their head yet. And it's, that it can introduce all sorts of shame, other people shaming them. But there's also that internal shame that we have, that we put on ourselves, or I do, and many people. I'm
I
part
would
of that.
argue.
I'm part of that.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm part of that club. And so I think looking at both those types of stigma to try and make headway, because health is affected. And one of the reasons why I really like working with pregnant and new moms is because you kind of get a 2-for-1 special, especially when the baby is born, is that you help the mom, but then the babies and the families benefit too.
Yeah, for sure. Do you know, or do you find that it's more prevalent in any specific demographic, like even like single moms, or like those below like poverty line, or anything like that? Like, is there any correlation there to, because I know you talked about like surroundings and stuff like that, and being kind of in a safe space and everything, but is there an elevated kind of risk for different demographics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's been a lot of research on risk factors, and I think you can probably find at least one study saying almost anything is a risk factor, because anything that causes stress could then lead into, being a risk factor. I think the biggest ones are previous mental health history. So that's not a particular demographic, though again, we know that certain populations and certain demographics have higher risk factors. Um, Stressful life events. So again, if you're struggling with money and that's stressful, that puts you more at risk. So sometimes it's these indirect factors versus, a particular racial profile based on, say, genetics. It's
Yeah.
more like, okay, are you dealing with systemic racism? Well, that's not good for anybody, right? And
Yeah.
so I think there's a lot of social determinants of mental health. And I think the more that we start paying attention to these, I think that will help us, kind of change society in a way that better supports mental health and moms, but also helps people not feel like, oh my gosh, this is all my fault. This is all my fault that I feel this way. Um, I think, any particular thing like, for example, marital status, it's one that you will find some studies that say like single moms are more vulnerable, but then there's also an even bigger chunk of literature that says unsafe relationships or abusive relationships are the worst. They're worse than being a single mom. Like if you're a single mom by choice and with a big support system, you're going to
Yeah.
be less vulnerable. So I think it's one of those things that there are some flags and they can be things like, oh, okay, this population is going to be more vulnerable, so we're going to routinely ask. But for me, I think you should just routinely ask everybody
Everyone.
because,
Yeah.
yeah, if you dig into the risk literature, it's like, do you have a history of pregnancy related complications, miscarriage or loss? Do you have previous, childbirth trauma? Did you go through a friend who had that? So those images are in your mind because you love them and you saw them have to struggle.
Yeah.
Do you bring some stuff to the table in terms of attachment issues with your own family, right? Like sometimes when you're um, there's a cool word from the anthropology literature called matrescence. It means like the birth of a mother. And so when you're a first time mom and you're trying to like transition to this identity as, being a mom, you look to role models, your own experience, and suddenly you may find yourself processing stuff that happened like 20,
Yeah.
30 years ago, or realizing like, oh, I'm so messed up by this, I don't want to mess up my kid. And
Mm.
it's there's all different things that can come, but definitely I think there are some groups that are more vulnerable than others, but there's also this individual piece too.
Yeah.
I think that it would be so, I don't know, because obviously I'm not a parent, but I think it would be so beneficial if it was a routine question that doctors ask postpartum,
Yeah.
asking about the symptoms of depression, because as you stated before, with like racial bias, and if you're dealing with racism and stuff like that, especially with the fear of losing your child, we know that disproportionately,
Yeah.
like the Black community and the Indigenous community are more at risk of losing their children than someone like you or I, like the
Yeah.
white community, right? So I think those people could be less likely to advocate for themselves due to fear. And
Yeah.
so if doctors, you know what I mean? And
We're
obviously,
opening the door kind of thing.
yeah, and obviously in Canada, we're so privileged with our universal health care. So I think that there's probably things that I don't understand for like the US and stuff. But yeah, I think that would be a great thing.
Yeah, and there are a lot of places that do routine postpartum and prenatal or antenatal screening. Like that's best practices. Screen everybody so nobody feels singled out. And as you're
Mm-hmm.
screening, don't apologize and be like, it probably doesn't apply to you because you're a white, whatever. But just, this is a routine thing. This is, 1 in 5 women. This is, I mean, I don't know what the pandemic stats are, but we've seen things, anxiety and depression in moms. Um, yeah, double or triple. And there has been some research done showing, you know, women who are pregnant during COVID are more vulnerable to anxiety. I mean, it makes sense. Like you kind of think,
Yeah.
I didn't even need research to tell me that, but there is research coming out that is showing people are more vulnerable. And it doesn't have to be physicians that do the screening. It could be with midwives. It could be
Mm-hmm.
public health nurses. I mean, our public health services are pretty busy right now. But I think the more that we implement these screenings, the better. We're doing much better in terms of screening for depression now in Canada. Anxiety tends to still fall through the cracks a bit and be more like, yeah, that's just normal. But we know that, anxiety is actually much more prevalent than depression and is a big predictor of depression. Like if you're anxious during your pregnancy, that can actually predict um, depression to a certain extent. It's one of the more robust predictors. So, yeah, I think screening should just be your blood pressure. This should be like mental health screening should be part of your vital signs. Let's just check in and see how you're doing with that, and have not only that piece, but then, and this is where we don't do as good a job, I think, is tied to resources and make it easy, especially for, again, some of those communities that you mentioned that might, for very good reasons, be hesitant to seek help.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, kind of going back to like that stigma and stuff like that, something that I see a lot, and when I tweeted that thing about being scared of childbirth and stuff, a lot of the responses, and even one of my doulas said this to me too. They were like, women have been giving birth forever. Like they've been doing this forever. And I think that for some people that is really comforting. And I think for other people, it's kind of like, yeah, women have been doing it forever. So like, why am I struggling so much with this? And I think that you kind of can apply that same logic to parenthood as well, of like, after the labor's over, like after that's out of the way, it's like, why is everyone else seeming to be able to do this so easily? Not easily, I think everyone knows that parenthood is difficult, but like, why is everyone else able to manage and I'm not? And I think that does really lend to so many people not coming forward and not wanting to admit it, because it's like, well, is that admitting that I'm a bad mom?
Yeah. And that's our deepest fear. And my son is 11 now, and I still get the "Am I a bad mom?" questions. I still that, and one thing we can do is use that as a sign of what we care about. If we're asking ourselves, "Am I doing a good job as a parent?" If we can just sort of tweak it a little bit, from "I should be doing better" to "Oh wait, this is my body and my brain's way of reminding me that I care about this."
Yeah.
Right. If
So
we can,
true. Yeah.
kind of make some of those tweaks. And, in terms of the doula who mentioned women have been giving birth, well, since the beginning people, I'm assuming that's how we kept going. I suspect women have been terrified since they have been giving birth. And if you think about what rates of morbidity and mortality were, not in modern times and in other countries, we are so lucky to be alive during this time. But maybe in terms of like our old brain and evolutionary benefit and adaptation, it was somehow helpful to be afraid, because maybe you wouldn't have wandered off to be by yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe you would have stuck close and been a little bit more anxious. Maybe you would have been sending out cues. I'm going to need help. Hey. Right. And maybe there are also things in our modern day environment, because we live often in these individualistic kind of environments versus, true villages or community settings where there would have been lots of people to swoop in. Maybe we need to be paying attention on a social level to say, hey, our systems are failing pregnant and new moms right now. It's affecting their mental health, versus somehow they're not strong enough and they don't have it together and they don't know what they're doing. So I think, sort of that balance. Obviously, I work with people on the individual level to say, like, okay, is there any way we can think about these things differently? Are there some tweaks we can make in terms of, put your oxygen mask on first, take care of yourself a little bit so that you can take care of the baby? Like, there are a lot of things that we can do as individuals, and that, I can do as a psychotherapist to help somebody through these times. But there are also these big kind of social issues as well that we need to be thinking about. And if you look at treatments for depression and anxiety in new moms, social support comes out as something that's really useful. And that social support isn't always useful for other things, or maybe the same condition at another period of time, it wouldn't be as important. But we really do need, to have help.
Yeah.
It's not a thing we should be doing alone.
Well, and I think that point is especially true during COVID, because I know, like my experience, like my husband hasn't been able to come to any of my appointments, or like ultrasounds or anything like that. And, and then when I'm actually going into labor, he's the only person that can be in the room aside from like our medical team, obviously. Which, you know, I think that it's, on one hand, I feel like not only is that just scary for like the obvious reasons of having like lesser support, but I think there's also kind of like this grief and sadness about like, well, this isn't what I pictured pregnancy being. Like you picture it being this kind of communal experience of your partner being able to be excited with you and be there, and your parents can be at the hospital and Alyssa can be at the hospital, and you know, and I think that kind of that loss is something that I feel like a lot of people during COVID are kind of being like, well, yeah, but like everyone is losing their jobs and everyone's losing family members, and like is it like right or fair for me to be upset about this thing when like I'm still able to get pregnant? And it kind of loops to me, it loops back into that whole you know, feeling of like, well, I should just be grateful that I can do this anyways, you know?
Well, oh my gosh. I want to unpack that. There's so much good, not good, but difficult stuff in there. Is that I think sometimes when people are well-meaning and trying to look on the bright side, they can be very invalidating, right? You know, there are things to grieve, right? And saying sometimes, you know, saying let's focus on 3 things we can be grateful for is really useful. And there's even some evidence that saying, you know, developing a practice of gratitude is useful for all sorts of things. But you also have to take that moment to, you know, kind of self-validate. Why does it make sense that I'm feeling this way? And, you know, and to have somebody else kind of make room for that. And I think sometimes people are just too quick to shut down other people's pain, and, you know, and that makes sense because it probably hurts them to see people they care about, you know, suffering. But I think it's like, we have sort of term in psychotherapy sometimes called that second arrow, like you're already done. That second arrow comes in, or I sometimes call it like the pylon, like you're already down and then you're kicking yourself too, or somebody else is kicking you. It's like, wait, like this is already hard. So, you know, I think that there's just so many extra feelings to manage and so much transition. And it's true, like this is a time of tremendous uncertainty in the world, right? But the way I look at it, that makes it doubly hard, because already being pregnant and being a new mom is huge in terms of uncertainty, and that's where anxiety loves to get in, right? It loves a gray area. It loves ambiguity, because then it can like lead you kind of over to that, hey, something bad might happen, you better prepare for that, kind of thing. So, you know, I think there's a lot of well-meaning stuff that happens, you know, during this period in terms of attempting to help people manage emotions and stuff like that. But sometimes it backfires. Like even gratitude, which is mostly good, can be bad. If you're in a bad situation and someone's beating you and you're like, well, at least I have a roof over my head. There are some situations maybe that would be helpful. If you actually have no chance of escape and you're a prisoner, then maybe that's going to help you survive during that period. But sometimes you have to say, no, this actually sucks. This is big time. And if I can figure out a way to make it better, I'm going to. And if not, at least I'm just going to sit with the suck and not, you know, somehow, you know, kind of convince myself that I'm the issue and I'm not, I need to be working harder or, you know, doing something different or better.
Well, and I don't think that this idea of like grief comparison is helpful at all, because I feel like we have so much capacity for empathy and sympathy, and so we can feel empathetic or sympathetic towards other people's circumstances and still have our own grief as well, right? Like I can look at someone and say, I'm so sorry that you have experienced this financial loss, but then I can also still look at you and say, I'm so sorry that you've, you know, lost this really exciting time in your life with your husband and with me. And we were talking the other day, just as a side note, I was like, what am I going to do? Like when you're in labor, do I just sit downstairs and do nothing? Like I want to be a part of this. I'm like, let me make this all about me.
Make her food. Make her food. No.
Yeah. She's like, I just won't tell you when I go into labor. I'm like, no, don't do that. But the other thing I was going to say about invalidating the experience as well is it's so true. And I think especially even people who are well-intentioned, I feel like I'm well-intentioned. When Sam comes to me and says, I'm so scared I'm going to die during childbirth, now I'm like, but you're not going to. And it's like, okay, probably not the best response. But for me, I'm like, I can't even humor the thought that that's going to happen. So it's almost like I'm reassuring myself as well that I'm like, okay, the stats are so low that you have everybody in your corner. Like Canada is a great country healthcare wise, right? Yeah. Like, and those are obviously well intentioned, but probably not super helpful in the moment.
Again, it depends. Different people could say the exact same thing to you, and from one person it's caring and it's actually information and it helps you kind of reality check the stats and be grounded, and then another person it can be invalidating. So again, this is why reflective listening and asking for feedback and having those solid safe relationships is really handy, so that if you do say something and it makes her feel worse, she could say, actually that didn't help. Right? Yeah. I didn't need stats. I needed a hug. Well, again, it's COVID, but if figuring out like there's there are times when we need to be seeking information, and when we're going through these new transitions and there's so much we don't know, we do need more information. But man, you can go down rabbit holes. There's anything from what car seat to buy to how do I prepare for birth? And you can have, you could have a birth plan and you've researched it and you're like, okay, finally I have my spreadsheet, or sorry, that's maybe a nerd thing to do, whatever. And,
she's got an Excel sheet.
And then it's all out the window. Right. Yeah. And it's one of those things that, there is so much uncertainty to tolerate. Right. And again, even something like reassurance, sometimes reassurance can be really helpful. But with anxiety disorders, for example, reassurance can get to be too much, and it actually sort of feeds it, because you're never really going to get the certainty you want. Right. So there's, if that is an issue for any of your listeners, Anxiety Canada is a nonprofit organization that I volunteer for, and they do on their website have information about like how to tolerate uncertainty, right? Because I think our instinct is to problem solve for things, right? And to try and figure stuff out. But there are some times that we do have to, sit with uncomfortable emotions and, and really tolerate that uncertainty and, be self-compassionate for ourselves, that is a hard situation. It's hard to be pregnant. It's hard to be living through a pandemic. And not let that, Alyssa, you brought up, I think, a really important word, which is comparison. I think we do a lot of social comparing, and some of that can be useful, right? We can learn things that way. But other times it can be really, really unhelpful, especially if we have the tendency to be hard on ourselves, or other people have the tendency to be hard on us. Whoa, so-and-so's doing this. Why are you not doing that? Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, with like the being hard on yourself thing, like going back into like almost invalidating yourself, like you said, it's like there's so many aspects, like beyond just parenthood and beyond labor and stuff like that. It's also like, like what car seat should I be buying? And then you feel bad, like, well, is this one safer? Like, well, what if I get the wrong one, and then whatever, or what if I can't afford the one that I think looks the safest? And like, I think there's just so many, like, should I be breastfeeding? Should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? It's like there's so many different aspects. And again, it's kind of like if you're feeling anxiety around that, and then you're feeling, like you shouldn't be feeling badly about these things, and you should be excited and whatever, because that's how it's kind of posed socially, then I think that lends to like this guilt and shame around the fact that you're feeling already like guilty and shamed.
Yeah, it's like the anxiety shame pile. And oh yeah, yes, it's this. I mean, it can happen to anybody at any time, but during this period of life, it's very difficult. And there is no, website that it's like, it's probably good nothing.com or like, best practices, science-based, here's all the research. Wherever you look through, they'll be like, oh, this list of car seats says this, and that list of car seats and this. And then you finally think, okay, I'm going to, I don't even know if it's still a thing, but I'm going to get a subscription to Consumer Reports because that's legit. And then you read an article that says people pay to get their products in Consumer Reports, or I finally pick one and then it's like not available in Canada. And I'm like,
oh my God, this is the bane of my existence right now.
Oh my gosh. And then I had a friend who like, just, cool as a cucumber. And again, not invalidating in my case, it worked well. And she just said, Melanie, anything you really need for a baby, you can get it at a 24-hour Shoppers Drug Mart. She said there are safety standards in place for all the important stuff in Canada. We live in Canada. For car seats, there's standards. For formula, there's standards. Everything you really need, you can get.
Yeah.
And it was really grounding for me because I can go down the rabbit hole. That's how my brain works. And sometimes I use it for good, and I'll research and learn and put a whole bunch of information in my head. And I'm like, oh, brain, you're doing such a good job. And then other times that very same brain infrastructure can make me miserable. So, I think it is useful to have those moments where we can ground ourselves without shaming ourselves, right? Oh, one term I use, and I don't know, maybe this will resonate with some of your listeners, is sometimes our brains are overachievers and we want the best. We want, the healthiest thing, the safest thing. And we need to learn to, kind of sometimes if we want the A+ to just be like, okay, this is, I'm looking at the difference between A and A+ here. I'm not looking at the difference between pass and fail.
Yeah.
Because pass and fail for baby stuff should have already been done for all the important stuff.
Yeah. Before it hits the shelves.
Shouldn't even have access to that, right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Something I think that, the public, which is like obviously a very broad term, but the internet public, I guess, forgets is that not everyone's parenthood, like not everyone wants the same things for parenthood. Not everyone wants the same things for pregnancy. For one person, being completely organic or really like of the earth is super important to them, and someone else just wants the cold hard facts of like what is tested best. I want this. And it's not up to the public, it's not up to me, it's not up to anyone else to decide, other than the people who are in place who decide if you are neglecting your child. That's their job. It's not anyone else's job to come online or talk behind your back in your friend group that, Sam's doing this. That's not our job. There's people who have that job.
Well, and I think also culturally as well is worth mentioning too, because I think there's, a lot of practices and standards and stuff like that in North America that things that are frowned upon and whatever, and like culturally in other areas are so normal and so, widely accepted and stuff like that. And I think that because the internet is such a mishmash of everybody, I think that it's like this international like shame spiral happening.
Absolutely. And so then on top of the internet, we have kind of our brains, which have these old parts that weren't meant for modern life, and I mean that's not how they evolved. Also, kind of bringing back stuff like you should be afraid of that, and elevators are weird, and this is weird, and that's weird. And I think between the internet and our kind of cave woman brain that's trying to help us, it's definitely a lot to manage. It is a great time of opportunity as well to figure out Who do I want to be? What kind of mom do I want to be? Okay, even though I was raised a certain way, maybe I want to try something different. And there is a lot of potential, I guess, during this period too, for growth, not just like actual growth of a baby, but growth of yourself and your identity, because it is going to start shifting, right? And it's weird because some people, I don't even think I felt like a grown up. And I was 35 when I had my baby. And I'm like, oh, what's happening?
Yeah, it's so true. I definitely don't feel, I feel like I'm a child still. Like I have such like imposter syndrome around that too, because like I'm like, just even like wheeling a stroller around my house, I'm like, I feel like someone's going to be like, you're clearly a child, so I don't know why you have a stroller, but like it's just such a weird imposter syndrome thing.
Yeah, Sam was even saying I think this was like a little bit earlier on, but wearing like tight clothing. She's like, I don't want to wear this tight clothing because people are going to be looking at me like, oh, you're pregnant. Like as if it's like
an like, inappropriate age to be pregnant or something.
You're 28.
Well, but again, where did that thought pop in from, right? Like there have been news stories where women have had negative comments, especially women in the public eye, newscasters. I've definitely I've seen at least one story where people are criticized for wearing clothing that shows their bump and stuff like that. And so who knows, maybe that was in there somewhere and stuff pops up. But again, I think, the type of therapy that I do, cognitive behavior therapy, and cognitive is just a fancy word for, how you're thinking, what you're thinking, that kind of stuff, is looking at, there's going to be all sorts of random thoughts that pop up. Not all of them are going to be true. Not all thoughts are facts. And there's an opportunity to get in there and decide what meaning you give them, decide how you're going to interpret them. And, going to a trusted friend to, if you can't do it on your own, to go to a friend or, a family member or a therapist. We're usually we're supposed to be non-judgy anyways. and have your best interest at heart. So we strive for that. And it's the same when we're trying to filter comments, whether it's, I'm guessing you guys get tons of comments on things, or ones just in daily life, maybe from our in-laws or random. When you have a baby, random strangers will give you advice.
Yeah.
This is not necessary. You know what I mean?
And sometimes, again, there's that. You have that opportunity to sort of try and get in between the words, whether they're coming from you or somebody else, and how they impact your behavior. Usually we can't get in them fast enough to not feel them, but to just kind of be like, oh, ouch, why did that? Oh, that hurt. Okay, well, that's BS. I'm not going to do that. Or, oh, that person is well-meaning and was trying to share their knowledge, but things have changed in the last 20 years. Or as you mentioned, Alyssa, I'm different, right? Like, there'll be different groups of friends, and some people will be like, don't have an epidural, there'll be an epidural spiral, and this will be all this. And then you'll have other friends who are like, epidural girl, get that epidural. You want that, right? And it may happen that you want it and then it's too late, or you don't want it and then you do.
Yeah.
And it's okay, right?
Yeah. It's so interesting that you mentioned the like, where does it come from side of the thought process. That's something that I've had to do like over the last 2 years in my own growth. But Sam and I were talking about that. I think it was actually on the podcast. And we grew up in a town where we actually did have quite a few teen moms in our high school. And so we did witness a lot of that kind of cattiness around these teen moms who honestly, their kids are so loved. Like they, they're a lot of them I still know. And I see them loving their children. And so it's like, so what was it all for? But that's something that I think is important to reflect on in yourself, is looking back and saying, okay, so why is this coming up for me? And then if you can, for me anyway, if I can recognize where it's coming from, I can sooner kind of like lay it to rest, because I can be like, oh, that's the why behind it. And it's not actually true for me.
Right. Yeah, that can definitely be useful. I mean, you don't have to know where it comes from to move through it. I think, it can be really useful to be like, oh, there's that little, pop-up ad from, that store I shopped at 10 years ago in that other town or whatever. I can see why that's coming up. But I also think, figuring out what your values are and what you want and moving towards that can be useful too. I think both are helpful. Definitely, of course, I love doing the work on trying to figure out the core beliefs and what's giving rise to some of that stuff, because I do think it can be easier as you're trying to ground yourself in your values and kind of move forward to, I don't know, kind of know what's going on. But I don't think that you need to, because that is it can be a lot of work to figure that stuff out. And sometimes when this stuff comes on in the perinatal period, you don't have that time.
Yeah.
You're lucky if you have time to brush your teeth. Not to scare you, Sam, but
Yeah.
Sometimes it's more about, okay, let's go for the things that are weighing you down the most in the moment, and then we can maybe dig around and do some of that good stuff later.
Yeah. Like you said, like everyone is so different. Everyone's circumstances are so different. So something that is really effective for one person, it might not be as effective in another person, or their circumstances aren't there to explore things in the same way, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of women who said, I had counseling for this. I thought I was over this. And it's like, but it's different when you're maybe holding your baby or thinking about that. And you're like, oh, I love you so much. And then, oh, I don't want anything bad to happen to you. And then suddenly you're thinking of the bad thing that happened to you. And then, it definitely can bring back a lot of things that you did think you had kind of said, okay, I'm moving on from that. And then it kind of just pops up in the same way as, hormonal stuff can flare up. I don't know, all sorts of stuff. You can lose your hair. You can, I don't know, just all sorts of stuff can go down during this period.
Lots of dreamy aspects of parenthood. I'm curious, actually. I was just kind of like throughout this conversation, I've been thinking about this, but do you find that, because I feel like there is still so much stigma, but I feel like there is becoming more understanding around like postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety and stuff like that. But I'm curious as well about, the partners to whomever carried the child. Do you find that they oftentimes are struggling in the same way or feeling invalidated? Because I've spoken before about, like, with my depression, like I do really think that if you're somebody that struggles with mental illness chronically, it does affect more than just you, because, you have the people around you feeling like, well, why didn't I see the signs, or how can I help, or feeling guilty or whatever, or feeling like, well, maybe I shouldn't bring my problems to them because they, whatever. And so I'm curious too, like, do you see a lot of that in the partners to whoever carried the child?
I think that's a great question. And I think health conditions, whether they're mental health or some other type of health conditions, do have ripple effects into the family. And, the bulk of my clinical practice is with moms. I've had some dads from time to time, but I don't do couples or family work. And I think if that is something that, mom is working with, they can check in with their partner, and they can set their own boundaries, which say, like, this is me, this is you. I'll tell you if you need to back off, but you're allowed to have your own feelings too. Like, I do think, again, depending on what the gender roles are, what the expectations are, you will see different stuff. Like, there's a lot of toxic masculinity stuff that suggests that men are not allowed to have feelings or express negative feelings or be sad, or, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in terms of partner mental health. And it doesn't have to be, the partner does not have to be a man, the partner could be whoever. That's, so yeah, I think that it's something that can affect the whole family system. And again, the whole family system, especially at this part, can be part of the solution too, or they can add to it, right? So I think there's always opportunities to build skills and knowledge for all the people, the person themselves, their close, kind of intimate circle, if that's, a partner, and then the close friends and and then society in general. Like, Alyssa, you mentioned the States versus Canada. I mean, Canada, we're lucky to have maternity leaves. I mean, if you work in a job that has kind of that stuff. I'm a sole proprietor, so I didn't. But in the States, they have very, very short maternity leaves. And there's some Scandinavian countries in Europe who have like awesome ones. And you know what? It does make a difference, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I sort of lost the thread there. Did I touch on what you were asking about? I feel like I maybe I didn't.
I think so, but I mean, I have another question that kind of goes into this as well, which is, I think that like with new parents and stuff like that, again, going back to like that guilt and shame and like, am I a good enough parent and whatever, I think something that we see so commonly is parents not taking time to care for themselves as well.
Yes.
And so I'm kind of wondering, like, what do you suggest in terms of finding ways to cope while being a new parent and dealing with that whole kind of new aspect?
Oh, yeah, that is so important. I think if you do have any support system that you can activate, and again, this is hard, extra hard during COVID, being okay with taking time to go on a date. Like, you don't just have to go and like scrub your floors or something like that, or go to a gynecology appointment or something like that, like to actually make that mental shift that if you do manage to have somebody taking care of your baby at some point, that you can just watch Netflix. Like, don't sit and, watch your show for half an hour while beating yourself up for watching that show. Actually take that time. And so I think there's a few things, like in terms of self-care, and this would apply for either parent or three parents or whatever the dynamic is. With new moms, we often talk about nests: nutrition, exercise, sleep, time to yourself, and support, right? And some people, it's really hard for them to ask for help. So even just like, I could spend a number of sessions on any one of those things, just trying to make a little bit of headway, taking down some barriers, whether they're cognitive barriers, like, oh, I'm a bad mom if I take time for myself, or if it's just actually, I have no time to go for to exercise in the way that I used to be able to do. I used to like to go to the pool, but then that's time to get there, and then I have to do this, and now it's COVID and that pool is closed, and I don't even know what to do. Like, often there is a lot of work to be done to adjust, like, how do I make this work for my new family system? And one of the things that I will often do with clients during this period is like do kind of like a time pie, like what time do you have and what are you spending it doing? And also then doing a values pie. What is it that is important to you and you want to be doing, so we can try and work towards getting those more aligned? And can you take a slice from one? And, usually what I will also do is say, when you are an individual without any kids, you have your whole pie to yourself.
Yeah.
And when you have a child, you don't get an extra time pie, right? I mean, we usually have deep reserves for love, right? And that, but we don't get extra time. And so usually our own piece of self-care pie takes a hit, and often our partner relationship, if we're, in a partnership, that takes a hit too. And that can be hard. And we often don't plan that and say, okay, we're going to have less time for each other. How are we going to navigate that? You don't really think about that because you're trying to like research car seats and deal with your body that's like flipping out. So you're not really thinking, oh yeah, I'm probably not going to make you coffee in the morning like I used to. Yeah. And you might feel upset about that because you're not even going to realize that that's going to be something that slides. That's a very personal example because that's something that happened to me. I didn't even realize that I used to make my husband coffee in the morning, and that was something that he really appreciated, and kind of in these are not his words, but in my words, like kind of viewed as an act of love. But I was getting up every 2 hours. I didn't even know what morning was. I wasn't making anybody I wasn't making anybody coffee.
Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
You know, and again, it's something like, maybe it's something small like that where you can be like, oh, I can make you coffee. I didn't even know you cared, or that was something that was important for you. And again, you know, figuring out what are some of the small things that may have shifted in your relationship, but what are maybe some of the big things as well. And, you know, it's hard. And recognizing that there is going to be this period where, if you are in a relationship, that relationship satisfaction is going to go down, because the research shows, like, there's like a measure called the dyadic adjustment scale, and it it goes down after you have your baby, which makes perfect sense. But again, from that shame and stigma and all that kind of perspective, if you don't know that, it can catch you by surprise. And this is where besties and, you know, other people, you don't need to know the literature on what happens on questionnaires. You know, I also am lucky enough to have a friend who, you know, who shared some stories about, you know, fights that happened during those early, you know, middle of the night moments where the baby wasn't, you know, sleeping and stuff like that. And I was like, oh wait, I remember. And you could kind of picture that story of your friend, and that then picture them, oh yeah, they got through that. And it can, you know, kind of give you that motivation and that inspiration. But I think I was just reading actually an article, and it was like, the antidote to toxic positivity is tragic optimism. so this idea of just kind of like radically accepting, okay, some things are going to be a bit of a mess for a while, and not trying to sugarcoat that, and not trying to say it's supposed to be rosy, right? But also not, you know, going down that hole and staying down there, just recognizing it, being compassionate, being self-compassionate, and kind of moving towards, okay, but I'm going to do this, and this is important, and I'm going to, you know, take advantage of this, you know, the good things out of this period of my life. And that's where the gratitude comes in, but without crapping on yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think going back to like about how like partnerships change and stuff like that, that was a conversation that Matt and I had, because I was like, you know, like we've talked a lot about like how I'm concerned about like my emotional kind of status, like following, you know, the birth and stuff like that. And I was like, you know, like I don't want you to think that the only support I need is if you're supporting our child kind of thing. Like as long as that's covered, that like then I'm covered too, because I'm like, you know, like I think I'm going to like need you there for me as well. And I think that's something that I've kind of seen with like friends and stuff like that have had kids, is like you know, it's so easy for the partner to default to, I'm taking care of our kid, like I'm trying to support you, whatever kind of thing. But that's so different from supporting that person individually as well as supporting your child. So that was a whole kind of conversation we had to have.
Yeah. Well, and I think again, you know, it's great that you can have those conversations beforehand. But even if you don't have the foresight, like, you know, I've had a lot of women who have history of mental health who actually have plans in place, and it actually goes a lot smoother for them, in some cases, than other people who are blindsided by it. And so I think, again, the more you can keep those lines of communication open, because there actually are some couples where they will say, don't worry about me, just take care of the baby. That's what I need from you. I need you to take care of the baby. And then you know, there are going to be other people who are like, no, you bring me the coffee. I need that love coffee. Like, you know, like, please, you know, I just need that. And then there are going to be some people who they need more than any one person can give. And that doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. That just sometimes you need professional help, and that professional help may look like psychotherapy plus medicine, and might also be friends bringing over some food. And again, this is where it does get tricky when you're trying to put your plans in place, you know, for health promotion with COVID, because it's like, you might have some people who are willing to drop off food at your doorstep, but it's just this, it is harder. It is harder.
It's so different,
just objectively harder right now. But I think, the more that you can say, okay, if I had a magic wand and it took away stigma, and if I, also just didn't thought that this was completely normal and nobody was going to judge me harshly if I was honest, what am I going to say to my partner? And then you can backtrack from there, but you want to try and give yourself this sense of, okay, maybe my thoughts or feelings are telling me this, that I shouldn't ask for this and I shouldn't need it even. And then ideal world you, and then maybe what you end up saying or doing is somewhere in the middle. That's fine, right? It's just about kind of shifting a little bit, from where you're at to trying to get the help you need. Ideally, you wouldn't even have to ask. That's the ideal world.
Yeah.
But we all know that that often we do have to ask for help.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like for me, within the realm of like my like intimate relationship specifically, I feel like being able to have conversations about our expectations of one another, to me, like that is kind of like a form of self-care, because it's like investing that time beforehand to discuss like, this is what I think I might need from you. This is what might change. I don't know. Like, and just being able to put that in place for yourself in the same way that, like if I'm doing other things for self-care, it's like kind of investing that time now so that like down the road, like you do have an easier time coping. And
yeah, I love that. And I think I'm glad you brought up the term self-care and extended it beyond the self, because self-care is more than just taking a bubble bath or something like that. That can be good and it can be a form of self-care. But my favorite definition of self-care is taking care of yourself like you would take care of a loved one. Right. Yeah. And if if you have a child, you will care about their relationship with you, and you will care about how's that going with your friend group. And they might, now I'm at the age of motherhood where it's healthy that they maybe don't want to talk to you about their friend group stuff, but you want to at least give them the chance to talk to it. And again, I think with self-care can include finances, making sure that you're not stressed about, self-care can be a much broader, kind of definition that includes areas of wellness, including relationships. So yeah, I definitely I'd like that for just self-care in general, and in particular this part of life. There are going to be these changing targets, right? Like what you need now might be different than what you need in 3 months, and different than what your baby needs or your partner. And I think, again, keeping those lines of communication and open is good. And the other thing, just general, sorry, I don't mean to be like, and please tell people, don't let your emotions boss you around, right? Like sometimes our emotions, they're a really good wake up call, and they're like, hey, pay attention to this. But we can have false alarms. We can have shame false alarms. We certainly get a lot of fear false alarms. Right. And I think it's good to be able to, sort of take that moment to reality check and say, okay, something is telling me I shouldn't disclose here. Is that in my best interest? Am I actually going to be unsafe if I do that? Or is that shame and internet garbage comments of people being mean to me, or teenage bullying, or is this stuff that's making me feel less than, that's actually I don't need to pay attention to because it's wrong?
Yeah.
Right. And so really, and this is why I love doing kind of that cognitive thinking work, is to be able to kind of get in there and be looking at, okay, there's what's going on in the environment, and there's how you feel, and what are some of the ways that we can get in there with doing things, and the way that you're thinking that can move you towards feeling better, feeling good about yourself, and doing the things that are important to you.
Yeah. Oh man, it's such a complex topic. There's just so many things that go into this whole transition.
Yeah.
It's such a roller coaster period, right? there's transitions, there's hormones, there like all sorts of stuff. This is a minefield.
Yeah, for sure. Well, do you have anything else that you wanted to touch on in today's episode?
I just wanted to make the little pitch that if anybody is interested in learning more about anxiety during pregnancy or as a new mom, that there is a special section on the Anxiety Canada website, anxiety.com, specifically geared towards moms and expecting moms as well.
That's awesome. And we'll link that in the description box of the YouTube and the description box on Spotify and all that kind of stuff as well. But thank you so much for coming and talking to us about it. This is like such an important topic that affects so many people, obviously, and I think there's not quite enough conversation around it. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you for your influence to bring attention to the matter. And I think it's very hard to be, vulnerable. And I think the more that we can show that vulnerability can also be strong and can help us connect to each other and, make us more powerful. I think it's a great message to be sharing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, a huge thank you again to Dr. Badali for coming on and talking.
Yeah.
I think it's just worth mentioning. I feel like the sentiments were kind of like echoed throughout, but I feel like it's worth just saying that, in terms of like being a good parent and stuff like that, I think parents that take care of themselves as well are the best parents, in my opinion. And I think that like definitely don't underestimate the importance of taking care of yourself too.
Yeah, like Dr. Badali said, put on your own oxygen mask first.
Yeah, exactly.
Then I actually said that to a friend recently, even though like I'm not a parent, you know what I mean? But I can still be a supportive friend. I was like, I feel like being a part of parenthood is taking care of yourself. Being a good parent is taking care of yourself. And I think the same is with being a partner, like being a good
and a friend and everything.
Taking care of yourself so you can then assist someone else. So yeah, self-care. You know that we love self-care.
We're all about it.
Yeah, so thank you so much again to Dr. Badali, and thank you to you guys for watching and listening or whatever you're doing, reading.
Yeah. And we will see you guys next time. My underboob is sweating in like a very dramatic way. And I think it's best we leave.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, Christ.
Let me see the sweat.
Dude.
Yeah.
At one point I was like, is my nipple leaking? Is it sweat? I was like, there's just so many things that could be going on here.